In the vast expanse of the Galactic Academy, where beings from 1,000 worlds gathered to learn the art of war and diplomacy, there existed an unspoken hierarchy. The Zephyrians with their crystalline intellects commanded respect through pure logic. The Drachmari earned fear with their warrior traditions spanning millennia. The ethereal collective moved like whispers, their telepathic abilities making them natural strategists. And then, there was Marcus Chen, a human from a small blue planet that most species had barely heard of until recently. When the Academy announced that each cadet would choose a mentor from the faculty for their final year, every instructor prepared elaborate presentations. They showcased their victories, their wisdom, their technological superiority. Ancient beings who had conquered star systems prepared speeches about their achievements. Masters of warfare polished their medals and battle scars. Marcus simply sat in the corner of the great assembly hall, reading an old book and occasionally sipping from a steaming cup of something that smelled like earth after rain. Yet when the selection ceremony began, something unprecedented happened. One by one, cadets from across the galaxy, beings who had been taught that humans were newcomers, primitive upstarts in the cosmic order, quietly made their way across the hall. They sat at his feet. This is the story of why. The Galactic Defense Academy floated in the neutral space between three star systems, a massive structure that defied easy description. Built from materials harvested from a dozen worlds, it gleamed with the silver blue of Altarian crystal, the deep red of Martian iron, and the shifting colors of Zephyrian thought metal. To most beings approaching it for the first time, it represented the pinnacle of interstellar cooperation and military excellence. To Marcus Chen, it looked like an oversized shopping mall that someone had launched into space. He stood at the observation deck of the transport shuttle, watching the academy grow larger in the viewport. Around him, other new faculty members pressed against the glass with expressions of awe and nervousness. Professor Thane, a towering Drachmari with scales that shifted from green to gold depending on his mood, was explaining the academy's history to anyone who would listen. Dr. Vexhai, an ethereal whose translucent form flickered with inner light, communicated telepathically with others of her kind, their mental conversations creating small auroras in the air around them. Marcus adjusted his simple brown jacket and checked his watch, an old mechanical thing his grandfather had given him. The other faculty members wore elaborate uniforms or carried impressive technological devices. Marcus had a worn leather satchel, the paperback book he'd been reading on the journey, and a thermos of coffee that he'd somehow managed to keep warm for the past 6 hours of travel. The shuttle docked with a gentle thrum that resonated through the academy's vast structure. As the new faculty members disembarked, they were greeted by Commander Zyx Thala, the academy's director, a being whose species was so ancient that most others had forgotten its name. She appeared as a constantly shifting geometric pattern of lights and shadows, speaking through harmonic frequencies that the universal translators converted into words. "Welcome to the Galactic Defense Academy," her voice resonated through the docking bay. "You join us at a crucial time in galactic history. The Void War has ended, but the peace that follows requires leaders who can navigate not just the battlefield, but the complex web of interspecies cooperation that our future depends upon." The group was led through corridors lined with portraits of famous graduates, heroes who had shaped galactic history, prevented wars, forged alliances between species that had been enemies for millennia. Professor Thane pointed out several Drachmari heroes, his scales shifting to proud gold. Dr. Vexhai's kind had produced many renowned strategists, their portraits somehow capturing the essence of their ethereal forms in static images. Marcus noticed that there were no humans in the portraits yet. Humanity had only joined the galactic community 15 years ago, after first contact had been established by accident when a human deep space probe had collided with a Zephyrian research vessel. The incident had been diplomatically described as an unexpected introduction between species, though Marcus suspected it had been more embarrassing than diplomatic at the time. Their tour continued through training facilities that showcased the Academy's purpose. Vast simulation chambers where cadets could practice everything from single combat to fleet coordination. Laboratories where the greatest minds from across the galaxy developed new technologies. Libraries that contained the collected knowledge of hundreds of civilizations. Marcus found himself particularly interested in the library. While the others marveled at the holographic archives and quantum storage systems, he wandered over to a section that seemed oddly familiar. Physical books. Actual paper books, leather-bound and, clearly old, sitting on shelves that looked almost quaint compared to the high-tech surroundings. An affectation of mine, I'm afraid, came a voice behind him. Marcus turned to see Commander ZYX Thala's shifting form approaching. Up close, she was even more impressive, like looking at a living constellation. I collect knowledge storage methods from various species. These belonged to the Altarians before they transcended physical form. They believed that wisdom required weight, substance. Marcus ran his finger along the spine of one book. The sensation was comfortingly familiar. My species has a similar belief. We say that some thoughts need time to develop, like wine aging in a barrel. Digital information is convenient, but sometimes wisdom needs to be earned slowly. Interesting perspective from such a young species. Commander ZYX Thala's pattern shifted in what might have been curiosity. Your file indicates you were selected for our faculty based on some rather unusual qualifications. No military background, no formal academic credentials in strategic studies, no notable achievements in any traditional martial arts. Marcus smiled. I teach high school. Or rather, taught high school. Earth history and literature, mostly. Some philosophy when the curriculum allowed it. High school, the commander repeated, the translator making the term sound exotic. And, you believe this prepares you to train the next generation of galactic leaders? Well, Marcus said, still running his hand along the book spines, if you can handle a classroom full of 16-year-old humans right after lunch on a Friday, you can probably handle most things the galaxy throws at you. The commander's pattern shifted again, definitely amused this time. We shall see, Professor Chen. We shall see. The faculty quarters were more luxurious than anything Marcus had ever experienced. His room was larger than his entire apartment back on Earth, with a viewport that showed the rotating tapestry of 3 star systems and furniture that adjusted itself to his physiology with almost unsettling precision. He unpacked his few belongings, some clothes, his books, a small photo of his family, and a coffee maker that he hoped would work with the Academy's power systems. That evening, the new faculty gathered for their first briefing. The main conference room was filled with beings from across the galaxy, each representing the pinnacle of their species' achievement in warfare, strategy, or diplomacy. Professor Thane commanded attention simply by existing 8 feet tall with battle scars that told stories of conflicts Marcus couldn't even pronounce. Dr. Vexhi's ethereal nature made her seem like she was already thinking 3 moves ahead of everyone else. Master Kendar, a Zephyrian whose crystalline form refracted light in patterns that hurt to look at directly, had written the standard texts on fleet tactics that were used throughout the galaxy. Marcus sat quietly in the back, occasionally taking notes in a physical notebook with an actual pen. The Academy's mission has evolved, Commander ZYX Thala explained to the assembled faculty. When it was founded 800 years ago, our purpose was simple: train military leaders to fight wars. But, the Void War taught us that the greatest challenges facing our civilizations cannot be solved through force alone. We need leaders who can build bridges between species, who can find solutions that no single culture could imagine alone. She gestured, and holographic displays showed statistics from the recent conflict. The war was won not by superior firepower or tactical brilliance, but by unprecedented cooperation between species who had previously been unable to work together. Our cadets must learn not just how to fight, but how to inspire others to transcend their limitations. The briefing continued with detailed explanations of the Academy's curriculum, its training methods, and its expectations for faculty. Each instructor would be responsible for a group of senior cadets for their final year project, a comprehensive examination that would determine their fitness for leadership positions throughout the galaxy. The cadet selection process will be interesting this year, Professor Thane rumbled, his voice like distant thunder. My understanding is that we have representatives from nearly every major species in the galactic community. Indeed, Master Kendar's crystalline voice chimed like wine through crystal caves. The competition for mentorship will be fierce. Many cadets will seek instruction from those with proven track records. Marcus raised his hand. What exactly do the cadets know about their potential mentors? They have access to our service records, publications, and notable achievements, Commander ZYX Thala replied. Though I understand that your file is rather unique in this regard, Professor Chen. Several other faculty members turned to look at Marcus with expressions that ranged from curiosity to barely concealed condescension. He was accustomed to being underestimated, it had been a constant throughout his teaching career. Young teachers were always viewed with suspicion until they proved themselves. The selection ceremony is tomorrow, the commander continued. Each cadet will choose their mentor for their final project. I trust you all understand the significance of this choice, both for the cadets and for your own positions here at the academy. As the meeting dispersed, Marcus found himself walking back to his quarters alone. The academy's corridors were quiet at night, lit by soft bioluminescent panels that created an almost peaceful atmosphere. He passed through sections designated for different species, areas where the gravity, atmosphere, and lighting could be adjusted to accommodate various physiological needs. He paused at one intersection where the corridor opened into a common area. Several cadets were gathered there, engaged in what appeared to be friendly conversation despite representing wildly different species. A young Drachmary was sharing a story that had the others laughing or making whatever sounds their species produced to indicate amusement. A Zephyrian was creating small light patterns in the air that seemed to illustrate the Drachmary's tale. Two ethereals floated nearby, their forms flickering with what Marcus was beginning to recognize as contentment. And, in the center of the group sat a human cadet, a young woman who couldn't have been more than 20, listening intently to the stories and, occasionally asking questions that seemed to delight the other cadets. Marcus watched for a moment, remembering his own classrooms back on Earth. The best learning always happened when students felt safe enough to share their perspectives with each other. He wondered if the Academy's structured approach to interspecies cooperation was as effective as this simple moment of young beings choosing to spend time together. He continued to his quarters and spent the evening reading. Not military strategy or galactic history, but a collection of poetry from various Earth cultures that he'd brought with him. Tomorrow would bring the selection ceremony, and he suspected it would be more revealing than the Academy's administrators expected. Marcus fell asleep to the gentle hum of the Academy's systems and the distant light of alien stars, his book still open on his chest, completely unaware that his presence had already begun to change the careful dynamics of one of the galaxy's most prestigious institutions. In the morning, he woke early and made coffee, real coffee that he'd somehow convinced the Academy's supply systems to replicate. He sat by his viewport and watched the stars slowly rotate as the Academy maintained its orbit, thinking about the day ahead. The selection ceremony would determine which cadets chose which mentors, but Marcus suspected it would also determine something far more important, whether the Academy was truly ready for the kind of change that the galaxy needed, or whether it was still trapped in old patterns of thinking about strength, wisdom, and leadership. He finished his coffee, picked up his worn leather satchel, and headed for what would prove to be one of the most significant days in the Academy's 800-year history. The Great Assembly Hall of the Galactic Defense Academy was a marvel of engineering that had taken 3 years to design and another 5 to build. Its architects had carefully balanced the atmospheric, gravitational, and lighting needs of dozens of different species while creating a space that conveyed both grandeur and unity. The result was a soaring chamber that seemed to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously, with sections that adjusted themselves to accommodate beings as diverse as the gas-form nebulans and the crystalline Zephyrians. On the morning of the selection ceremony, the hall buzzed with nervous energy. 237 senior cadets from across the galaxy filled the graduated seating areas, while their potential mentors occupied a raised platform that ran along one side of the chamber. The ceremony was as much tradition as practical necessity, a formal recognition of the mentor-student bonds that would shape the final year of each cadet's education. Marcus Chen sat at one end of the faculty platform, having arrived early with his coffee and the book he'd been reading. He'd chosen a simple dark suit for the occasion, the same kind he'd worn to parent-teacher conferences and school board meetings back on Earth. Around him, his colleagues had dressed to impress. Professor Thane wore ceremonial Drachmary armor that gleamed like polished emeralds, each piece inscribed with the symbols of his military victories. Dr. Vexhai had intensified her ethereal glow, making her appear like a benevolent spirit of war. Master Kendar's crystalline form had been polished until it refracted the hall's lighting into spectacular prismatic displays. Marcus sipped his coffee and watched the cadets settle into their seats. He'd spent the previous evening reading their files, not their academic records or psychological profiles, but the personal essays they'd written about why they wanted to serve in the Galactic Defense Forces. The essays had been more revealing than any official documentation. There was Cadet Zarathul, a young Drachmarie whose scales were still the bright green of youth. Her essay had spoken of wanting to prove that strength could be protective rather than destructive, that warriors could build rather than merely tear down. Cadet Pixen, a Zephyrian whose crystalline form was shot through with veins of unusual silver, had written about the loneliness of pure logic and his hope to learn how emotion and reason could work together rather than in opposition. The human cadet he'd observed the previous evening was their Toque Cadet Sarah Martinez from the lunar colonies. Her essay had been refreshingly blunt about humanity's newcomer status and her determination to prove that being new to the galactic community didn't mean lacking valuable perspectives. Commander ZYX Thala's harmonic voice filled the hall as she began the ceremony. Senior cadets of the Academy, you stand at the threshold of your final year. The mentor you choose today will guide you not just through your remaining studies, but toward your understanding of what leadership means in our complex galaxy. She gestured toward the faculty platform. Your instructors represent the finest military and strategic minds our civilizations have produced. Each brings unique expertise, hard-won experience, and proven methods. Marcus noticed that she didn't mention his name specifically, though her light patterns seemed to flicker in his direction with what might have been uncertainty. The ceremony began with the faculty presentations. Professor Thane stood first, his massive form commanding immediate attention. His voice carried the weight of authority earned through centuries of combat experience. I offer the wisdom of the warrior's path, he rumbled. I have led fleets through the fire of the Void War, commanded ground forces on 17 worlds, and earned scars in service to species not my own. I can teach you to stand firm when others flee, to make decisions when the cost of failure is measured in millions of lives, and to find honor even in defeat. His presentation continued for exactly 10 minutes, the allotted time covering his military philosophy, training methods, and expectations for any cadet who chose to study under him. It was impressive, polished, and delivered with the confidence of someone accustomed to being respected. Dr. Vexhai floated forward next, her ethereal form seeming to dance in the air as she spoke. The mind is the greatest weapon, her telepathically transmitted voice echoed in the hall. I offer instruction in the arts of strategic thinking that transcend the limitations of any single species' perspective. My methods have been refined through study of conflicts across 3 galaxies and 7-dimensional planes. Master Kendar followed, his crystalline voice creating harmonics that made his words seem to come from everywhere and nowhere. Logic is the foundation upon which all successful leadership rests. I will teach you to see clearly, to think without the contamination of emotion or personal bias, and to make decisions based on pure mathematical probability. One by one, the faculty members made their presentations. Each was a masterpiece of military achievement, scholarly accomplishment, or strategic brilliance. Weapons masters demonstrated techniques that could disable opponents in seconds. Tactical geniuses explained victories that had saved entire civilizations. Diplomats recounted negotiations that had prevented wars before they could begin. Finally, Commander ZYX Thala turned to Marcus. Professor Chen, your presentation. Marcus stood slowly, walking to the center of the platform with his coffee cup still in hand. The hall fell quiet, not the attentive silence that had greeted the other presentations, but something more curious. Several faculty members had turned to watch, their expressions ranging from interest to barely concealed skepticism. I'm a teacher, Marcus began, his voice carrying easily through the hall despite its conversational tone. I've spent 15 years in classrooms with young humans who were trying to figure out who they wanted to become. They were brilliant, frustrating, inspiring, and completely unpredictable, sometimes all in the same day. He paused to take a sip of coffee, seemingly oblivious to the formal nature of the ceremony. I don't have battle scars or strategic victories to show you. I've never commanded a fleet or prevented a war through brilliant negotiation. What I can offer is something different. He looked around the hall, making eye contact with cadets from a dozen different species. I can teach you how to fail forward. Professor Thane's scales shifted to a confused bronze color. Master Kendar's crystalline form flickered with what might have been irritation. Marcus continued. Every great leader I've ever studied, human or otherwise, had one thing in common. They all failed spectacularly at some point, and they all learned to transform those failures into wisdom. The galaxy doesn't need more perfect strategists or flawless warriors. It needs leaders who can make mistakes, learn from them, and help others do the same. He set his coffee cup down on the podium and picked up his book, the same worn paperback he'd been reading since his arrival. This is a collection of stories about ordinary people who found themselves in extraordinary circumstances. They made mistakes, they doubted themselves, they sometimes made decisions for the wrong reasons and somehow stumbled into the right outcomes. They were human and flawed and absolutely essential to their communities. Marcus closed the book and looked directly at the assembled cadets. I can't promise to make you into perfect leaders. But I can promise to help you become the kind of person others choose to follow, not because you're stronger or smarter or more experienced than they are, but because you understand that leadership isn't about being the best at everything. It's about helping everyone else become better at being themselves. He picked up his coffee cup and walked back to his seat. His presentation had lasted less than 5 minutes, half the allotted time, and had contained no military terminology, no impressive credentials, and no promises of glory or victory. The hall was silent for a long moment. Then, Commander ZYX Thala began the selection process. Cadets will now indicate their choice of mentor by joining their selected instructor at the platform. You have 30 minutes to make your decision. The traditional method was for cadets to approach their chosen mentors in order of academic ranking, with the highest achieving students selecting first. It was efficient, orderly, and emphasized the meritocratic values that the Academy prized. But tradition, Marcus was about to learn, could be surprisingly fragile. Cadet Zarathul was ranked third in her class, high enough to essentially guarantee her choice of any mentor. She stood slowly, her young green scales catching the light as she looked around the hall. Every faculty member on the platform was distinguished, accomplished, proven. Professor Thane was of her own species, offering the comfort of familiar culture and the prestige of studying under a legendary Drakmari warrior. She walked across the hall and sat down on the floor in front of Marcus's chair. The silence that followed was profound. Professor Thane's scales shifted through several colors before settling on a perplexed orange. Dr. Vexhi's ethereal form flickered with surprise. Even Commander ZYX Thala's shifting patterns seemed to pause. Marcus looked down at the young Drakmari cadet sitting cross-legged at his feet. That's an interesting choice, Cadet Zarathul. May I ask why? You're the only instructor who talked about learning from failure, she said, her voice carrying the formal tones of her species but with an underlying warmth. The others offered to teach me how to avoid mistakes. You offered to teach me how to survive them. Before anyone could respond, Cadet Pixan stood up. The young Zephyrian's crystalline form moved with careful deliberation as he walked across the hall and settled into a meditation pose next to Zarathul. My species values logic above all else, he said, his chiming voice clear in the silent hall. But logic without wisdom becomes mere calculation. You spoke of understanding rather than knowing, and that is what I need to learn. The third cadet to move was Sarah Martinez, the human. She grinned as she joined the growing circle at Marcus's feet. Sorry, Professor Chen, but you're stuck with at least one student from your own species. Besides, she added, settling into a comfortable cross-legged position, I've been watching you since yesterday, and you're the only instructor who listens more than you talk. The movement seemed to break some kind of barrier. Across the hall, cadets began to stand and move. Not all of them. Professor Thane's military bearing and proven experience attracted a solid group of cadets who value traditional strength. Dr. Vexhi's strategic brilliance drew those who saw leadership as primarily an intellectual exercise. Master Kendar's crystalline perfection appealed to cadets who believed in the supremacy of logical decision-making. But a steady stream of students from across the galaxy made their way to the simple human in the brown jacket who was sitting quietly with his coffee, watching with interest as his colleagues' carefully planned presentations were disrupted by young beings who had decided that wisdom might matter more than credentials. There were ethereals whose translucent forms shimmered with nervous energy as they joined the circle. A pair of Altarian survivors whose energy-based existence manifested as gentle auroras around Marcus's chair. 3 more humans, 2 Drachmari, a Zephyrian who seemed to be vibrating with excitement, and several species that Marcus hadn't yet learned to identify. By the time the 30-minute selection period ended, Marcus found himself surrounded by 43 cadets representing 15 different species, the largest mentorship group in the Academy's history. Commander Zyx Thala's harmonic voice carried a note of something that might have been amusement. An unexpected development. Professor Chen, are you prepared to mentor such a large group? Marcus looked around the circle of young faces, some recognizably humanoid, others utterly alien, all looking at him with expressions of hope and curiosity. He thought about his old classroom back on Earth, about the students who had challenged him every day to become a better teacher. I think we'll figure it out together, he said. What none of them realized yet was that the selection ceremony had done more than assign mentors to cadets. It had created something unprecedented in the Academy's 800-year history, a group that would challenge every assumption about leadership, cooperation, and the nature of wisdom itself. In the days that followed, the other faculty members would observe Marcus's unconventional methods with everything from professional curiosity to outright skepticism. Some would wait for his experiment to fail. Others would begin to question their own approaches. But the cadets who had chosen to sit at the feet of a simple teacher from Earth were about to discover that sometimes the most profound lessons come not from those who have mastered everything, but from those who remain curious about everything. The real education was about to begin. The Academy's Training Center 7 had been designed for advanced tactical simulations. Its walls could project any environment from across the galaxy, its floors could simulate gravity from 0G to the crushing pull of a neutron star, and its atmospheric controls could replicate the air of 100 different worlds. It was a technological marvel that typically hosted elaborate military exercises and complex strategic scenarios. On the morning after the selection ceremony, Marcus Chen stood in the center of the empty chamber with 43 cadets arranged in a loose circle around him. He had requested the room's systems be turned off, leaving just basic lighting and standard atmosphere. The walls showed their default neutral gray, and the only sound was the gentle hum of the Academy's life support systems. This is our first lesson, Marcus said, settling down cross-legged on the floor. Sometimes the most important training happens when we're not trying to prove anything. Cadet Zarathul shifted uncomfortably. Professor Chen, shouldn't we begin with assessment exercises? The other groups are already running combat simulations and strategic planning scenarios. Are they? Marcus asked mildly. And what do you think they're learning? The young Drachmari paused, her scales shifting through thoughtful colors. Tactics. Leadership protocols. How to make decisions under pressure. Important skills, Marcus agreed. But, tell me, Cadet Zarathul, in your experience, when do beings make their worst decisions? Under pressure, she answered, though it sounded more like a question. Sometimes. But, often, we make our worst decisions when we're trying to impress someone else, or when we're so focused on looking competent that we forget to actually be helpful. Marcus smiled. So before we start learning how to lead, I want to know who you are when you're not performing. He gestured to the circle of cadets. I want each of you to tell us about a time you failed at something that mattered to you. Not a tactical error or a training exercise that went wrong, something personal. Something that taught you something about yourself. The silence that followed was profound. In their previous classes, cadets were encouraged to showcase their strengths, to demonstrate their fitness for leadership through displays of competence and confidence. Marcus was asking for vulnerability. Cadet Pixen, the young Zephyrian whose crystalline form had been vibrating with nervous energy since the selection ceremony, finally spoke. My species values logic and rational thought above all else. We're taught that emotions are distractions from clear thinking. His voice carried the harmonic quality of his people, but there was something different about its tone. But, when I was younger, I had a pet, a small creature from our home world that my family kept because it helped with emotional stability. He paused, his crystalline form dimming slightly. When it died, I was devastated. I couldn't think clearly for days. My family was ashamed, and I was sent to specialized training to help me overcome what they called logical instability. I learned to suppress emotional responses so thoroughly that I became exactly what my people wanted: a perfect thinking machine. His form brightened again, but the light seemed somehow sadder. It wasn't until I came to the academy that I realized I hadn't overcome my emotions. I had just stopped feeling them. And a leader who can't feel anything isn't really a leader at all, they're just a computer that happens to be made of crystal. The admission hung in the air. Several other cadets shifted uncomfortably, recognizing something of themselves in Pixen's story. Sarah Martinez spoke next, her human features expressing an empathy that transcended species barriers. I failed at being normal, she said with a self-deprecating smile. Growing up in the lunar colonies, there was enormous pressure to be exceptional. Humanity was new to the galactic community, and everyone felt like we had to prove ourselves worthy of being here. She drew her knees up to her chest, looking younger than her 20 years. I tried so hard to excel at everything: academics, physical training, cultural studies of other species. I was determined to be the perfect human representative. But the harder I tried, the more I lost sight of why any of it mattered. What changed? Marcus asked gently. I met an old maintenance worker named Chen, no relation to you, professor, who had been on Luna for 30 years. He was just this quiet guy who fixed atmospheric recyclers and never said much. But one day I was having a breakdown about my test scores, and he sat down next to me and said, "You know, kid, the best thing about humans isn't that we're perfect. It's that we keep trying anyway, even when we know we're not." Sarah's smile became more genuine. He was right. I stopped trying to be the perfect human and started trying to be a decent person who happened to be human. My scores actually improved, but, more importantly, I started making real friends instead of just impressing classmates. One by one, the cadets shared their stories. A young ethereal named Luxera spoke about her struggle with the collective consciousness of her people and her desire to think independently. A Drakmari warrior caste member talked about his fear of violence despite coming from a culture that valorized combat. An Altarian energy being described the loneliness of existing as pure thought without physical form. Marcus listened to each story without judgment, occasionally asking gentle questions that helped the cadets explore their experiences more deeply. He shared no wisdom, offered no solutions, and made no attempt to fix anyone's problems. He simply listened, and, in doing so, created a space where these young beings from across the galaxy could begin to understand themselves and each other. When the formal class time ended, none of the cadets made any move to leave. They continued talking, sharing experiences and perspectives that transcended their species' usual boundaries. A Zephyrian and a Drakmari discovered they both struggled with their culture's rigid expectations. 3 human cadets found they had more in common with their alien classmates than they had expected. Professor Chen, Cadet Zarathel said as the group finally began to disperse, "What did we actually learn today? I mean, in terms of leadership training?" Marcus was packing his simple satchel, the same unhurried movements he had used in his Earth classroom. "What do you think you learned?" "I think." She paused, her scales cycling through thoughtful colors. "I think I learned that everyone here has struggled with something. And that maybe leadership isn't about being perfect, but about understanding how to help others when they're struggling too." "That's a pretty good first lesson," Marcus agreed. Word of Marcus's unconventional methods spread quickly through the academy. By the end of the first week, other faculty members were discreetly observing his sessions. Some came out of professional curiosity, others out of skepticism, and a few out of what seemed like genuine concern. Professor Thane appeared at the doorway of Training Center 7 during the third session, his massive form filling the entrance as he watched Marcus's group engaged in what appeared to be a storytelling exercise. The cadets were taking turns sharing legends from their home worlds, but, instead of focusing on the heroes and victories, Marcus had asked them to explore the failures and mistakes that made the heroes relatable. "Interesting approach," Thane rumbled to Marcus after the session. "Though I confess I don't understand how sharing personal weaknesses prepares these cadets for leadership responsibilities." "Walk with me," Marcus suggested, and they strolled through one of the academy's observation decks that looked out into space. Tell me, Professor Thane, in your experience, what makes soldiers choose to follow one officer over another? The Drachmarie scales shifted to thoughtful bronze. Competence. Proven ability. Respect earned through achievement. Those are important, Marcus agreed. But, what about when competence isn't enough? What about when the situation is so new or so complex that no one really knows the right answer? They paused at the viewport, watching the distant stars wheel slowly past. I had a student once, back on Earth, named Michael Torres. Brilliant kid, but he had this desperate need to never be wrong about anything. He would spend hours preparing for class discussions, researching every possible angle so he could dominate every conversation. Marcus smiled at the memory. The other students respected his intelligence, but they didn't trust him. They knew that if they admitted confusion or asked for help, Michael would see it as an opportunity to demonstrate his superiority rather than as a chance to help them understand. And this changed how? Thane asked. One day we were discussing a particularly complex historical event, and Michael gave his usual brilliant analysis. But then, Jenny Martinez, Sarah's older sister, actually raised her hand and said, "That makes sense intellectually, but I'm still not sure I understand why people made those choices emotionally. Could you help me with that?" Marcus turned to face the imposing Drachmarie. For the first time, Michael admitted he didn't understand the emotional components either. And, instead of seeing his admission as weakness, the other students saw it as invitation. They spent the rest of the class exploring the question together, and Michael learned more that day than he had in the previous month of trying to prove how much he already knew. Professor Thane was quiet for a long moment. You believe that admitting ignorance makes leaders more effective? I believe that admitting ignorance makes leaders more trustworthy, Marcus corrected gently. And trust is what transforms a group of individuals into a team. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of running footsteps. Cadet Luxera, the young ethereal, appeared around a corner, her translucent form flickering with distress. Professor Chen, Professor Thane, we need help. There's been an incident in Training Center 5. They followed her quickly through the academy's corridors, arriving at Training Center 5 to find a crowd gathered outside. Through the transparent walls, they could see a complex tactical simulation in progress, or rather, in the process of falling apart spectacularly. Professor Kendar's mentorship group was attempting a fleet coordination exercise, but something had gone wrong. The holographic display showed a disaster in progress, with simulated ships scattered across space and communication networks failing. Several cadets were shouting orders that contradicted each other, while others stood frozen, apparently overwhelmed by the complexity of the scenario. The simulation was supposed to be a standard multi-species coordination exercise, Kendar's crystalline voice chimed with obvious frustration. But the cadets cannot achieve consensus on command structure or tactical priorities. Logic dictates clear hierarchies and optimal solutions, but they persist in allowing cultural differences to cloud their judgment. Marcus watched the chaos through the transparent wall. How long has this been going on? 47 minutes, Kendar replied. I have attempted to provide guidance on 17 separate occasions, but they continue to prioritize emotional considerations over mathematical optimization. And what happens if they fail the exercise? The simulation will record their performance as inadequate preparation for advanced leadership roles. Marcus nodded thoughtfully. Professor Kendar, may I make a suggestion? The Zephyrian's crystalline form shifted, refracting light in patterns that suggested skeptical attention. Let them fail, Marcus said simply. I beg your pardon? Let them fail completely. Let the simulation run its course, record their mistakes, and, then, ask them what they learned from the experience. Kendar's form flickered with what might have been confusion. But failure in leadership training is one of the most valuable learning experiences available, Marcus interrupted gently. Professor, have you ever failed at something important? The question seemed to catch Kendar off guard. Zephyrians were known for their logical perfection, their ability to calculate optimal solutions to complex problems. The very idea of failure seemed alien to their nature. My species does not experience failure in the same way others might, Kendar replied carefully. I know, Marcus said, his voice carrying unexpected sympathy. That's why your students are struggling. They're trying to achieve a perfection that doesn't exist in real leadership situations. They need permission to be wrong so they can learn how to be better. As they watched, the simulation finally reached its catastrophic conclusion. The holographic fleet was scattered, communication had broken down completely, and the mission was listed as a total failure. The cadets stood in stunned silence, some visibly upset, others defensive. Marcus could see Kendar struggling with the concept. But, if I allow failure, how do I prepare them for situations where failure means lives lost? By teaching them how to recover from failure quickly, how to learn from mistakes without being paralyzed by them, and how to support each other when things go wrong, Marcus replied. Perfect tactics are useless if your team falls apart the first time something unexpected happens. Professor Thane, who had been listening quietly, spoke up. In the Void War, my most successful operations were those where my officers felt safe enough to tell me when they thought my orders were wrong. My worst defeats came from troops who were so afraid of disappointing me that they followed obviously flawed commands rather than risk speaking up. That evening, Marcus found himself in the Academy's faculty lounge, a space designed to accommodate the social needs of a dozen different species. Professor Thane was there, along with Dr. Vexhai and several other instructors. The conversation turned, inevitably, to the day's events and the unconventional approaches being tried by various faculty members. I'd been observing the humans' methods, Dr. Vexhai's telepathic voice carried across the lounge. His results are unexpected. How so? Asked Commander ZYX Thala, who had joined the group. His cadets are beginning to collaborate in ways I have not observed before, the ethereal replied. Today I watched a Drakmari warrior defer to a Zephyrian's tactical analysis, not because hierarchy demanded it, but because she genuinely believed his approach was superior. A week ago, such cooperation between those species would have been unthinkable. They trust each other, Marcus said quietly. When you create an environment where being wrong isn't catastrophic, beings start focusing on finding the right answer instead of defending their positions. But surely there must be standards, protested Master Velvar, an instructor whose species Marcus hadn't yet learned to identify. Leadership requires certain fundamental competencies. Absolutely, Marcus agreed. But competency and perfection aren't the same thing. A leader who has never made a mistake is either a liar or someone who has never been tested. Commander ZYX Thala's shifting patterns indicated deep thought. Professor Chen, your approach raises interesting questions about our traditional methods. But, how do we measure success? How do we know whether your students are truly prepared for the responsibilities they will face? Marcus smiled, thinking of his former students back on Earth, the ones who had gone on to become teachers, scientists, artists, and leaders in their communities. I suppose we'll find out when we see how they handle real challenges. But I suspect that a group of beings who know how to admit mistakes, learn from failure, and support each other through difficulty might be surprisingly resilient. As the evening wound down and the various faculty members dispersed to their quarters, Marcus realized that his presence at the academy was creating ripples that extended far beyond his own mentorship group. Other instructors were beginning to question their methods, to experiment with different approaches, and to consider that perhaps wisdom wasn't always the same thing as knowledge. The real test, he knew, would come when his students faced their first major challenge. And, given the Academy's reputation for throwing complex scenarios at its senior cadets, Marcus suspected that test wouldn't be long in coming. The alarm that echoed through the Academy at 0347 local time wasn't scheduled. Marcus Chen woke to the sound of emergency klaxons and the sight of red emergency lighting casting strange shadows across his quarters. His first thought was that this was another simulation. The Academy was famous for its surprise training scenarios that tested cadets' ability to respond to unexpected crises. His second thought, as he pulled on his clothes and checked his comm unit, was that the fear in the voices echoing through the corridors sounded far too real for any simulation. All faculty and senior cadets report to Emergency Command Center immediately, Commander ZYX Thala's harmonic voice cut through the chaos. This is not a drill. Repeat, this is not a drill. Marcus grabbed his jacket and headed for the command center, joining streams of beings moving through corridors that suddenly felt too narrow. The Academy's sophisticated systems were in full crisis mode, atmospheric controls adjusting for optimal performance under stress, lighting shifted to maintain alertness, and the gentle background hum that usually promoted calm replaced by the subtle urgency frequencies that would keep everyone focused. The emergency command center was a massive chamber Marcus had only seen during his orientation tour. Holographic displays covered every surface, showing real-time data from across 3 star systems. Faculty members clustered around different stations while cadets stood in organized groups, their training evident in how quickly they had assembled despite the early hour and obvious stress of the situation. Situation report, Commander ZYX Thala announced as the last stragglers arrived. Her shifting light patterns were more agitated than Marcus had ever seen them. At 0312, we received a distress signal from the civilian research station Harmony Point, located in the Kepler 442 system. The station has lost all primary power and is operating on emergency life support only. The main holographic display shifted to show a 3-dimensional map of the local star systems. A pulsing red dot marked the location of Harmony Point, uncomfortably far from any major shipping lanes or military installations. The station houses 47 researchers from 12 different species, working on a joint xenobiology project, the commander continued. Their emergency life support will fail in approximately 18 hours. The nearest military vessel is 22 hours away, even at maximum emergency speed. Professor Thane's deep voice rumbled through the chamber. What about commercial shipping? Emergency evacuation protocols? No commercial vessels in range, replied the Academy's operations chief, a Zephyrian whose crystalline form was crackling with nervous energy. The research station was deliberately positioned in a remote location to avoid interference with their sensitive experiments. Marcus found his mentorship group clustering near him, their faces reflecting the same growing understanding that was dawning on everyone in the room. The Academy wasn't just being informed of a crisis, they were being asked to respond to it. The Academy ships, Commander ZYX Thala continued, are primarily training vessels, not equipped for long-range emergency rescue operations. However, we have one possibility. The display shifted to show the technical specifications of a ship Marcus hadn't seen before. The experimental vessel Harmony was designed for extended multi-species missions. It's still in its testing phase, but it's our only asset capable of reaching the research station in time. What's the catch? Asked Dr. Vexhai, her ethereal form flickering with anticipation. The ship requires a crew trained in multi-species cooperation protocols. More importantly, it requires a command structure capable of making decisions under extreme pressure while maintaining cooperation between species that have historically had difficulties working together. Marcus felt a cold certainty settling in his stomach. You want to crew it with senior cadets. Not just any cadets, Commander ZYX Thala's pattern shifted to what Marcus was learning to recognize as grim determination. We need a crew that can function as a truly integrated unit, not just a collection of individuals following orders. The ship's systems require constant coordination between operators with different physiological and cognitive capabilities. She turned to address the assembled faculty members. Each mentorship group represents a different approach to leadership and cooperation. We need to determine which group is best prepared for this mission. The silence that followed was heavy with implication. This wasn't just a rescue mission, it was a live test of every educational philosophy represented in the room. Professor Thane stepped forward. My cadets have extensive training in crisis management and multi-species tactical operations. They understand chain of command and the importance of decisive action under pressure. Logical choice, Master Kendar chimed in, his crystalline voice carrying certainty. However, my group has been trained in optimal resource allocation and systematic problem solving. Their approach would minimize risk while maximizing probability of mission success. Dr. Vexhai's ethereal form pulsed. Strategic thinking will be crucial. My cadets understand how to anticipate problems and plan for multiple contingencies. One by one, the faculty members made their cases. Each group had legitimate strengths, proven training methods, and cadets who had excelled in their specialized areas. Marcus listened as his colleagues outlined their students' qualifications, their own experience, and the various advantages their approaches would provide. When they turned to him, he was quiet for a long moment. "Professor Chen?" Commander ZYX Thala prompted. "I'm thinking about what kind of crew the researchers on that station need right now," Marcus said finally. "They're scared, they're probably arguing about what to do, and they're from 12 different species with different ideas about hierarchy, decision-making, and crisis management." He looked around the room at his colleagues. They don't need to be rescued by perfect soldiers or flawless strategists. They need to be rescued by people who understand how to work with scared, confused beings from different cultures and find a way to help them cooperate long enough to solve their problems. Cadet Zarathal stepped forward, her scales shifting through nervous colors. "Professor Chen, are you volunteering our group for the mission?" Marcus looked at his 43 cadets, representing 15 different species, many of whom had chosen him as a mentor specifically because they felt like outsiders in their own cultures. 3 weeks ago, they had been strangers struggling to understand themselves. Now they stood together with a unity that had surprised even him. "I'm saying that if we're going to ask cadets to risk their lives on a real mission, we should send the ones who have the best chance of working together when everything goes wrong," Marcus replied. "Not the ones who look best on paper when everything goes right." Commander ZYX Thala's pattern shifted rapidly, clearly weighing options and probabilities. "This is highly irregular. The traditional protocols, with respect, Commander," Cadet Sarah Martinez interrupted, stepping forward to join Zarathal. "The people on that station don't care about traditional protocols. They care about whether we can get them home alive." More cadets from Marcus's group moved forward, not in any organized formation, but as a natural expression of their readiness to act. Cadet Pixen, the young Zephyrian who had struggled with his people's emphasis on pure logic, stood next to Luxera, the ethereal who had chosen individual thought over collective consciousness. 3 Drakmari warriors flanked 2 human engineers and an Altarian energy being. Professor Thane's scale shifted to what Marcus was beginning to recognize as respect tinged with concern. These cadets have promise, but they lack formal crisis training protocols. The mission parameters will require improvisation, adaptation, and the ability to make decisions as a team rather than following a predetermined command structure, Marcus interrupted gently. "Professor, you've trained excellent soldiers. But this mission needs something different." The debate continued for several more minutes, with faculty members raising valid concerns about experience, training protocols, and the risks of sending an experimental crew on a mission with lives at stake. Marcus found himself defending not just his students, but a fundamentally different philosophy of leadership. Finally, Commander ZYX Thala raised one of her appendages for silence. "We will proceed with a compromise. Professor Chen's group will crew the rescue mission, but they will be accompanied by experienced faculty advisors who can provide guidance during critical phases." "No," Marcus said quietly. Every head in the room turned toward him. Commander ZYX Thala's patterns flickered with surprise. "I beg your pardon?" "No faculty advisors," Marcus repeated. "If we send adult supervision along, then the cadets aren't really making decisions, they're just following orders from people they think know better. The researchers on that station need a crew that can think for themselves and adapt to unexpected situations." "Professor Chen," Dr. Vexhai's telepathic voice carried a note of genuine concern, "you're asking us to send children into a life-threatening situation with no experienced oversight. I'm asking you to trust that young beings who have learned to work together and support each other might be more capable than you think," Marcus replied. He looked around the room at the assembled faculty members, beings who represented centuries of military experience and strategic brilliance. "Every one of you was young once. Every one of you had to face your first real test without someone holding your hand." He turned to his cadets, seeing their mix of excitement, fear, and determination. "The question is, do you think you're ready?" Cadet Zarathal spoke for the group. "We don't know if we're ready, Professor Chen. But we know we want to try." "And if you make mistakes?" Commander ZYX Thala asked. "Then, we'll learn from them," Cadet Pixen replied, his crystalline form steady despite the magnitude of what they were discussing. "And we'll help each other fix whatever we can fix." The final decision took another hour of debate, technical briefings, and detailed mission planning. In the end, it was the simple fact that no other option was likely to succeed that tipped the balance. The Academy's other crews were either too small, too specialized, or too focused on single-species protocols to handle the complex coordination the rescue mission would require. As dawn broke over the Academy, casting long shadows through the transparent corridors, Marcus found himself in the hangar bay watching his students prepare for their first real mission. The ship Harmony was unlike anything in the Academy's regular fleet, sleek, sophisticated, and designed from the ground up for crews that represented multiple species working as true equals. "Are you sure about this?" Professor Thane asked, joining Marcus as they watched the cadets running through their pre-flight preparations. "These are good students, but they're still students." "The risks are real," Marcus agreed. "But so are they. Look at them, Professor. Really look." In the hangar, the cadets moved with purpose and coordination that would have seemed impossible just weeks earlier. Human engineers worked alongside Zephyrian navigators, sharing information and solving problems together. Drachmary warriors deferred to ethereal strategists when their expertise was needed, while the ethereals listened carefully to the warriors' tactical concerns. There was no rigid hierarchy, no formal command structure, just a group of young beings who trusted each other enough to be honest about their limitations and confident enough to contribute their strengths. "They're not perfect," Marcus continued. "They'll make mistakes, they'll face problems they've never encountered before, and they'll probably have to improvise solutions that no textbook ever covered." "And that doesn't concern you?" Thane asked. Marcus smiled, watching Cadet Sarah Martinez help a young Altarian with an equipment check while Cadet Zarathal coordinated with the ship's AI systems in 3 different languages. "It gives me hope," he said. "Because that's exactly what the galaxy needs right now, leaders who can figure things out as they go, who can bring different perspectives together, and who care more about getting the job done than about looking like they have all the answers." The ship's engines began their startup sequence, filling the hangar with a low hum that seemed to resonate with possibilities. Marcus's students were about to face their first real test, not in a simulation chamber designed for learning, but in the vast complexity of space where mistakes could mean death and success would require everything they had learned about working together. As the Harmony lifted off from the Academy's hangar and disappeared into the star-filled darkness, Marcus realized that he had learned something too. Sometimes the best way to prepare young beings for an uncertain future wasn't to give them all the answers, but to help them become comfortable with asking the right questions together. Now they would all find out whether 3 weeks of learning to trust each other would be enough to save 47 lives and prove that wisdom could matter more than experience, that cooperation could triumph over convention, and that sometimes the most important lessons couldn't be taught, they could only be lived. The Academy's long-range communications array would keep them in contact with the mission, but ultimately, his students were on their own. Just as he had always intended them to be. The Harmony had been traveling for 8 hours when the first crisis hit. Marcus Chen sat in the Academy's communications center, watching holographic displays that showed his students' progress through space. The rescue ship was making good time toward the Kepler 442 system, but the readings from Harmony Point Research Station were becoming increasingly desperate. Life support was failing faster than predicted, and the station's mixed-species crew was beginning to panic. "Communication from the Harmony, Professor Chen," the communications officer announced. "Audio and visual feed available." The main display shifted to show the ship's bridge, and Marcus felt a moment of pride at what he saw. His students had arranged themselves in a configuration that no Academy textbook had ever described, but that seemed to work perfectly for their mixed group. Cadet Sarah Martinez sat in the captain's chair, but she was clearly functioning as a coordinator rather than a traditional commander. Around her, cadets from different species occupied positions based on their abilities rather than their rank or seniority. "Professor Chen," Sarah's voice came through clearly, though Marcus could see the stress in her expression. "We need to discuss our approach to the rescue operation. We're getting some conflicting information from the research station." "What kind of conflicts?" Marcus asked. Cadet Zarathal moved into view, her Drachmary scales shifting through worried colors. The station's crew is divided about evacuation priorities. The Zephyrian researchers want to save their data archives first, claiming they contain crucial information for future missions. The Altarian team insists that evacuating the most physically vulnerable researchers should be the priority. And the human contingent is arguing for a democratic vote on evacuation order. Marcus could see similar debates playing out in the background as other cadets monitored communications and coordinated their approach. This was exactly the kind of situation that traditional command structures were designed to handle: clear orders from above, established protocols for decision-making, and hierarchical authority to resolve disputes. "What do you think you should do?" Marcus asked. Sarah smiled, though it was strained. "We think we should stop asking them to agree with each other and start helping them work together." Over the next 3 hours, Marcus watched his students implement an approach that defied conventional rescue protocols. Instead of imposing a solution from outside, they began working with different groups on the research station to understand not just their positions, but the fears and concerns driving those positions. Cadet Pixen, the young Zephyrian who had struggled with his people's emphasis on pure logic, opened a private channel with the Zephyrian researchers. Rather than arguing against their desire to save data, he helped them understand which information was truly irreplaceable and which could be reconstructed later. More importantly, he helped them see that their expertise would be needed to rebuild the research project, meaning their survival was more important than any data archive. Cadet Luxera worked with the Altarians, her own experience as an individual thinker among a collective consciousness helping her understand their concerns about leaving vulnerable team members behind. She helped them develop a support system that would allow the most fragile researchers to be evacuated safely without requiring them to go first. Meanwhile, the human cadets on Marcus's crew worked with their counterparts on the research station to transform the debate from a zero-sum argument about priorities into a collaborative problem-solving session about logistics. "It's working," Commander ZYX Thala said, joining Marcus at the communications center. "The research station's internal communications are becoming more cooperative. But they're cutting it very close on life support." As if summoned by her words, another alert came through from the Harmony. This time it was Cadet Zarathal speaking, her scales now cycling through the deep blues of intense focus. "We have a problem," she announced. "The research station's docking bay was damaged in whatever caused their power failure. Our ship can't dock normally, and their emergency airlocks are incompatible with our systems." Marcus felt the familiar sensation of a classroom problem becoming suddenly, urgently real. This was the kind of challenge that required improvisation, adaptation, and the willingness to take calculated risks. "Options?" he asked. "We're working on several approaches," Sarah replied, moving back into view. "But we wanted to consult with you about something unusual we're considering." The camera view shifted to show the entire bridge crew, and Marcus could see the mixture of determination and uncertainty on their faces. These were young beings who had learned to trust each other, but they were about to face the ultimate test of that trust. "The research station has emergency escape pods that are compatible with our systems," Cadet Pixen explained, his crystalline form steady despite the stress. "But they only have 17 pods for 47 researchers. Normally, this would mean multiple trips, but we don't have time for multiple trips." However, Luxera added, her ethereal form flickering with nervous energy, "the pods were designed for single-species crews. Each pod is optimized for specific atmospheric and gravitational needs." Marcus was beginning to see where they were going. "You want to mix species in the pods." "It's completely against safety protocols," Sarah admitted. "The pods aren't designed for multi-species occupancy. Different atmospheric requirements, different gravity tolerances, different temperature needs. But if we can figure out compromise settings that everyone can survive for a short time." "It's risky," Zarathal continued. "Some species might be uncomfortable or even in distress. But it's the only way to evacuate everyone in a single trip." Marcus looked at the display showing the research station's failing life support systems. Traditional protocols would require prioritizing evacuees, leaving some behind for a second trip that might not be possible. His students were proposing something that had never been tried: a rescue operation based on cooperation and mutual support rather than triage and abandonment. "What do the researchers think about this plan?" he asked. "That's the interesting part," Sarah replied with a smile that was becoming more confident. When we explained the situation and asked for volunteers to share pods with other species, we had more volunteers than we needed. It turns out that beings who've been working together on a multi-species research project for 2 years have already learned to trust each other. The Zephyrian researchers offered to modify their atmospheric requirements to accommodate Altarians, Pixan added. The human team figured out gravitational settings that would be tolerable for both themselves and the Drakmari crew members. And the Ethereals, Luxera said with something that might have been pride, volunteered to share their pods with anyone who needed accommodation, since our energy-based physiology can adapt more easily than most. Marcus realized he was witnessing something unprecedented in the Academy's history. His students weren't just executing a rescue mission, they were demonstrating a completely new approach to multi-species cooperation, one based on mutual support rather than hierarchical authority. Do you think it will work? Commander ZYX Thala asked quietly. I think, Marcus said, watching his students coordinate with the research station's crew, that it will work because they believe it will work. And because they've learned to support each other when things get difficult. The actual evacuation took 47 minutes longer than a traditional triage approach would have taken, but fast enough to beat the life support failure. Marcus watched through the Harmony's cameras as researchers from 12 different species squeezed into pods designed for single-species crews, supporting each other through atmospheric compromises, gravitational adjustments, and the general stress of emergency evacuation. The Zephyrian researchers helped their Altarian companions manage gravitational effects they weren't used to. The human crew shared their techniques for dealing with atmospheric variations. The Ethereals provided reassuring presence for species who found their energy forms calming. Most importantly, nobody was left behind. When the Harmony finally docked with the Academy 18 hours later, it carried all 47 researchers from Harmony Point, along with a crew of cadets who had proved that sometimes the most important leadership skill was the willingness to try something that had never been done before. Marcus was waiting in the hangar when his students disembarked. They looked exhausted, stressed, and absolutely triumphant. More importantly, they moved together as a unit that had been tested under real pressure and emerged stronger. Professor Chen, Sarah said as the group approached him, we need to debrief the mission. There were several moments when our protocols deviated significantly from Academy standards. I'm sure there were, Marcus agreed. But, first, tell me what you learned. The cadets looked at each other, communicating in the silent way that teams develop when they've been through challenges together. We learned that cooperation isn't just about following rules, Zarathal said, her scales cycling through confident gold tones. It's about understanding what the rules are trying to accomplish and finding new ways to accomplish those goals when the old ways don't work. We learned that leadership isn't about having all the answers, Pixan added, his crystalline form steady and bright. It's about helping everyone else find answers together. And, we learned, Luxera concluded, her ethereal form glowing with satisfaction, that beings from different species can trust each other enough to share life support systems if they understand that they're all trying to solve the same problem. Over the following days, word of the successful rescue mission spread throughout the Academy. Faculty members who had been skeptical of Marcus's unconventional methods began requesting observations of his classes. Other mentorship groups started experimenting with collaborative approaches to traditional exercises. Most importantly, the rescued researchers from Harmony Point requested permission to address the Academy's cadets. Their presentation became one of the most attended events in the institution's history. You saved our lives, Dr. Thanemore, the lead Zephyrian researcher, told the assembled students and faculty. But, more than that, you showed us something we hadn't realized about ourselves. We had been working together for 2 years, but it took a crisis and the example of young beings who truly trusted each other to teach us how to genuinely cooperate. The Altarian researcher, a being of pure energy whose presence filled the auditorium with gentle light, added, your rescue operation succeeded because you understood something that most military protocols miss, that strength comes not from individual excellence, but from the willingness to be vulnerable with others in service of a common goal. Professor Thane, who had been one of Marcus's strongest critics, approached him after the presentation. I owe you an apology, Professor Chen. I believed that leadership required certainty, authority, and proven competence. Your students demonstrated something I had not considered, that leadership might actually require curiosity, humility, and the courage to attempt unprecedented solutions. Marcus smiled, thinking of his old classroom back on Earth and the students who had taught him as much as he had taught them. I think leadership requires all of those things, Professor. The question is which ones we emphasize and when. Your approach produces leaders who can adapt to completely new situations, Thane continued, his scales shifting through thoughtful colors. Traditional methods produce leaders who excel within established systems. Both have value, but the galaxy is changing, Marcus finished. And the challenges we're going to face probably won't look like the challenges we've faced before. In the weeks that followed, the Academy's approach to leadership training began to evolve. Marcus's methods were studied, adapted, and integrated into curricula that had remained unchanged for centuries. Other faculty members began experimenting with collaborative approaches, emotional intelligence training, and scenarios that emphasized cooperation over competition. The changes weren't without controversy. Some traditionalists argued that the Academy was abandoning proven methods for untested philosophies. Others worried that emphasizing cooperation over authority would produce weak leaders who couldn't make difficult decisions. But the results spoke for themselves. Marcus's students, when tested against traditional metrics, performed as well as any previous cohort. When tested against new scenarios that required innovation and adaptation, they consistently outperformed groups trained in conventional methods. More importantly, they seemed genuinely excited about their future roles as leaders. Instead of viewing command positions as burdens to be borne with stoic dignity, they saw leadership as opportunities to help others achieve goals that no individual could accomplish alone. As Marcus prepared for his second year at the Academy, he received a message that brought everything full circle. It was from Michael Torres, his former student who had struggled with the need to be right about everything. Professor Chen, the message read, I wanted you to know that I just accepted a position as a junior instructor at the Mars Colonial Academy. I've been thinking a lot about our conversations about admitting ignorance and asking for help. Yesterday, I told my first class that I didn't know the answer to one of their questions, and we spent an hour exploring it together. It was the best teaching I've ever done. Thank you for showing me that not knowing everything doesn't make you weak, it makes you curious. Marcus smiled and looked out his viewport at the stars wheeling past. In a few hours, a new group of senior cadets would gather for their mentor selection ceremony. He had no idea who would choose to sit at his feet this year, or what challenges they would face together. But he was certain of one thing: the galaxy needed leaders who could bring out the best in others, who could find strength in diversity, and who understood that wisdom wasn't about having all the answers, it was about asking the right questions and having the courage to explore them together. As it turned out, that was exactly the kind of lesson that beings from across the galaxy were ready to learn. And Marcus Chen, a simple teacher from a small blue planet, was exactly the right person to help them discover it for themselves. The Academy had been training leaders for 800 years. But it had taken a human who specialized in helping teenagers figure out who they wanted to become to teach it how to prepare beings for a future that would require them to become more than they had ever imagined possible. And that, Marcus thought as he prepared for another day of learning alongside his students, was exactly what education was supposed to do.